All right, so here we go. Let's get into it. Georgia is a 2.5-point favorite at Alabama. Just to give you an idea, and I was banging around and Bear, Chris Felica, Bear Bets podcast right here. You can check that out wherever you get your podcasts. He had this great graphic on his podcast, so I wanted to show it on our show here. This is kind of a graphical representation of what was going on in our world in 2007, the last time that Alabama was a home dog. So it's 2007. The number one movie is Spider-Man 3. Number one song is Irreplaceable by Beyonce. Look at the average gas price, $2.85. Can we get back to that? That'd be nice. Tebow is the Heisman Trophy winner. American Idol was the number one TV show. I remember that. We all remember that. That's what was going on the last time Alabama had to roll into their home stadium, Bryant-Denny, as a home dog. And here we go. Georgia rolls into town as a 2.5-point favorite. Remember, Bama was favored even in that Joe Burrow game. They were favored in the Texas game last year, and those are the only two losses that they've had in their last 61. So Bama's 59-2 in their last 61 home games. That goes back to 2015. So that 19 Burrow LSU team, they beat them in Tuscaloosa, and last year the Ewers Texas team, they beat them in Tuscaloosa as well. The Tide have their planned five, I would say like their starting five offensive linemen, they're back. We saw that against Wisconsin, and I thought that that was actually a huge deal for them. The way they played as an offensive line against South Florida was far different than the way they played as an offensive line against Wisconsin. So getting those tackles back was huge for them. And we saw that starting offensive line, and I think that that's going to create even more explosive runs and the ability, and this is important, the ability to sustain drives. I think they'll have less penalties as a group up front, and they'll have more base down success running the football for 3, 4, and 5 yards, which can keep them on schedule and allow them potentially to sustain a long drive. That was one of the questions that I've had with Alabama, and I think that getting that starting offensive line back is going to continue to help them. Now, Milroe, his stats against Georgia last year in the SEC championship game are not going to blow your mind, but he made some huge plays in that game. Remember, Bama beat Georgia in that game, and he had 2 touchdowns, 192 passing yards, and only 29 on the ground. But remember, in our game, for some reason, we haven't adjusted this. Sacks count against your rushing yards as a quarterback. So if you really strip out the sacks from that game, which there were 4 of them on Milroe, he actually ran it for 67 yards. And if you're telling me like there's hidden yards in there for 67 yards, that's a few first downs, obviously, for the game. That's an impactful day from Jalen Milroe. I think that this guy has improved even from last year. They're highly explosive in the passing game because of what's going on the outside. I love Ryan Williams. This is an offense that creates a lot of big plays, a ton of them. And I think that's going to be a big deal. Meanwhile, on that Georgia side, their defense is banged up a little bit. Michael Williams hasn't played since leaving the Clemson game. Now, he's a potential top 10 pick, and when I'm reading the things that Kirby Smart has said and listening to some of his comments this week, he's saying he's hopeful that Michael is going to come back, but he's not overly confident in that, which means I don't love that. You start rolling into these matchup style games. When I say matchup games, it's like talent is equated here, okay? So these are matchup games. You are matched up evenly against the opposition, which is not generally the case in college football. In these matchup games, injuries matter to a great deal. I do think it is strength against strength. Check this out. Bama's offense has 11 touchdowns right now of 25 or more yards. I was just speaking to that with their explosive plays. That's tied for the most in college football. Again, 11 touchdowns of 25 or more yards. Georgia on defense, conversely, is a team that does not give up the explosive play. And you would obviously anticipate that with not only their skill level, but also their schematic advantage with a guy like Kirby. They haven't allowed explosives really all year. Only 1 pass play of 20 yards all season. So now you get kind of a strength against strength matchup. And I can't wait to see how that pans out. Because largely, Bama has not had to drive the length of the field in order to score. I don't think that's a weakness. It's just something that we haven't seen. So maybe we have to see that this week, which is why I started with the offensive line in terms of sustaining drives. We might have to see Jalen Milroe and Alabama sustain some drives in order to get points in this one. On the opposite side of this, let's take a look at when Georgia has the ball and Bama's on defense. And the question that I have, and I think everybody should have, is can Georgia take advantage of big play opportunities against this Bama secondary? Now, if you're just looking at this, you would probably say like, it's questionable. Nobody for the Bulldogs has more than 2 catches of over 25 yards right now through 3 games. So do they have that downfield threat? See, I don't think it's been a great transition post Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey. So while you still have Carson Beck, it's very different for a quarterback to roll out there with a skill position group that I think has taken a bit of a step backwards. That doesn't mean they're not talented, and maybe that they're going to start to produce, but it's not proven by any stretch of the imagination. And through three games, we haven't really seen it from an explosive standpoint. And I actually think that's where you have to attack Alabama. They're very strong in just like the interior of their defense, their athleticism, their aggressiveness. They're a really good defense. I like what Bama does defensively. However, the holes that I've seen on film when I was preparing for the Wisconsin game and then even in the Wisconsin game were twofold. The perimeter run game is there to be had, in particular if your quarterback is willing to run on the outside. That's there. Even the Ches Malusi fumble against Alabama, that was a big gain before he put the ball on the turf. And then the other side of this is that there are wide receivers open behind the secondary for Bama, and we've seen that over multiple weeks. The difference is that South Florida and Wisconsin were unable to connect. So we don't sit here and lament the big plays that Alabama gave up, although they were there to be had. So can Georgia, even with a group that has not shown a proclivity to explosive plays, can they create them in this game? I actually think that is the entire key to the game. And I know it's tough to do that on the road, and they're going to be playing in an environment that is incredibly tough to play in. But the ability to create explosives is, one, the fastest way to quiet an opposing crowd down, and it will immediately give everybody a lot of concern on that sideline because this is what has popped up previously on film. Remember that secondary for Alabama. Malachi Moore is back, and then when they're in nickel, any situation where there's 3 or more wide receivers on the field, when they're in nickel defense, they get an extra defensive back on the field. There's 5 defensive backs. 4 of them are new this year. 2 transfers, 2 true freshmen. Very talented, great players, new together. Now, maybe this has been fixed over the course of an off week. Maybe. But if I'm Georgia, I've got to attack, and I've got to go down the field in order to see what's going on. Their offensive line is obviously dealing with that huge injury to their guard, probably the best guard in the country, one of the top offensive linemen in the country, Tate Ratledge. He underwent tightrope surgery on his ankle. He will be out. Carson Beck had an AC joint sprain in his non-throwing shoulder. I actually don't think that that's an issue at all because I dealt with that both in my throwing shoulder and non-throwing shoulder. He should be fine. That's just a pain management style of deal. And the last thing I will say is maybe Georgia's defense looks a little bit better now that we've seen Clemson explode offensively. And we remember back to that week 1 game and we're like, oh yeah, they were totally bottled up by this Georgia defense. All right, so let's get to the pick. That was a lot going on for that game. So what's the pick, Joel? Georgia's the favorite on the road at Alabama. Here's where it comes down to. I told you that the key was Georgia being able to create and hit on those explosives when they potentially arrive, and yet I have no evidence that they're going to be able to do that. So I'm riding with the tide. I think Alabama wins. Milroe plays well, and I think Alabama wins a classic, a tight ball game, and it's going to be 24-21 at home. Bama wins and covers. Thank you for watching the Joel Klatt Show YouTube channel. And if you like this clip, make sure to like it and subscribe to the channel, and you can stay up to date on all of my college football coverage.